How's it going? And welcome to Project Dictator, where we talk about dictators and authoritarian governments throughout the world. Today's video, we're gonna talk about the history of dictatorships and totalitarianism in Puerto Rico. I'm not gonna focus about one specific individual. I'm gonna focus about the history of it and how certain governors throughout the history of Puerto Rico had committed a horrible atrocity that to this day are never been acknowledged or never went to prison for their crimes. And for our history, people know the first governor of Puerto Rico was Juan Ponce de Leon, who committed genocide against the native Taino people. And this is where in 1511, the first ever revolution, and not only the entirety of the Americas, but the first ever revolution for the independence of Puerto Rico, was in 1511 by the Taino people, led by the cacique, which is the chief leader of the island of Borinquen, which was the indigenous name of Puerto Rico, Agüero II. Although in the beginning of the revolution was a success, at the very end they were slaughtered by the Spaniards with their superior technology, especially their armor and weaponry. And that sadly Juan Ponce de Leon continued the genocide against the native population. After this, we also had Alonso Manzon, who was the bishop who also became a governor of Puerto Rico. He, although he is often been credited with making the first advanced education and other important things in Puerto Rico, he was the main leader of the Inquisition of the island. Because people often forget the Inquisition, their headquarters was in Puerto Rico. It was made so they could find hidden Jews, so they can massacre the Jewish people. Because Puerto Rico, to this day, has the largest Jewish population in the entirety of the Caribbean. Throughout the history of Puerto Rico, especially during Spanish colonial reign, every governor, with some exceptions, were military governors. Some of them last for almost a decade, while others barely lasted a couple of weeks. It was basically chaotic because the queen decided who was governor and who was not. And throughout the history, they persecuted the independence movement in Puerto Rico. For the longest time, it was illegal to promote independence. It was illegal to publish any independent style literature. It was illegal, to do anything that supports freedom and liberation, regardless of the political philosophy you subscribe to. And in many cases, that Puerto Rico was so poor that during the 1860s, even the richest people didn't have shoes. That's how poor the conditions were on the island. So many revolutions happened besides 1511. There was the 1811 insurrection by the one of the earliest known bishops who was native born in Puerto Rico. Although that failed and he was persecuted. The first female pro-independent revolutionary, Maria de Barbosa, who was exiled by the government, who was put in prison as a traitor, finding out she had newspapers of the liberation struggles of Simon Bolivar. And the 1822 revolution for Puerto Rican independence, led by the Freemasons, that they were caught in the island of Caracas in the Dutch islands of the Caribbean, but because they were allies with the Dutch government, they found refuge and then suffered persecution. There was also the 1834 and 1838 revolution by the founder of the municipality of La Marias, and he was exiled on multiple occasions before becoming the first governor of, not my mistake, not the first governor, but the first mayor of that area, municipality. In many cases, the revolutionaries who were less revolution, who wanted to promote independence, but they wanted to do more practical grounds. Let's achieve autonomy first, and then independence later, like a two-stage theory, how to achieve liberation. The governor, Romualdo Palacio Gonzalez, was the governor of Puerto Rico during the founding of the first autonomous party in Puerto Rico. Although they were basically bunch of reformers who believed in independence but in the long term. But this governor refused to support any form of independence like other governors before him, suppressing the revolutions of 1511, 1822, the 1811 insurrection, the 1834, the 1838, the 1868 revolution, also known as the Cry of Lares, and the 1897 revolution, the attempted coup at Yauco, which are also suppressed by the governor of the Puerto Rico at the time. Ramon persecuted the founder of the first autonomous party of Puerto Rico, Roman Valdoriotti de Castro. who was a revolutionary for the independent Puerto Rico, who was imprisoned by him. Although he was released shortly after, he was so sick and health stricken that he died shortly after. There is an urban legend that he was tortured and murdered by the government of Puerto Rico, like the governor at this time. And other similar governor like Andre Gonzalez Munoz, who was also a governor of Puerto Rico, but only for a brief period of time. And like again, he supported and suppressed, like all governors before, the independent movement by imprisonment, torture, and possible assassinations of certain independence movements. And he was the leader fighting against the revolutionary for the independence of Cuba during the 10 Years' War. And after the Spanish-American War, the first American governor in Puerto Rico was Nelson A. Miles, who was one of the people responsible for the Wounded Knee massacre, and he was the one who led the invasion against in Puerto Rico, using 16,000 troops to invade the island. He became the first civilian governor of Puerto Rico, and like I said, he was a mass murderer. The other governor, John A. Brooker, was the second American governor in Puerto Rico, and like Miles, he was also involved with the Wounded Knee massacre and the invasion of Puerto Rico throughout this time. And like I said before, the treatment against Puerto Ricans, especially black Puerto Ricans, was very oppressive, and treating anybody who wasn't a white person, basically a white Spaniard, was subhuman for the most part, which is very sad when you think about the brutality of humanity, especially when you have hierarchy in the mix. And also, the other governor was Guy Werner Henry, who was one of the people responsible for eliminating the autonomous government of Puerto Rico. For people don't know, for 1 year, Puerto Rico actually achieved their independence somewhat. The same, similar to Canada or Australia, where you have your own autonomous government, but you still have the Queen of State. Something like that. And he was one of the responsible to eliminate it, of the autonomic charter. He also eliminated taxes on food. The only good thing we can say about him that he put the 8-hour workday, but he wasn't involved. Luisa Capetillo, the anarchist communist Puerto Rican, who first introduced feminism in Latin America, was the one responsible for suffragists and the 8-hour workday and other basic necessities you need as a human being. And also we had George Whitefield Davis, who was another governor of Puerto Rico. And like I said, throughout this time, every governor up until 1952 was a military government. So it was only military personnel who became governors on the island. George Whitefield Davis wasn't only a governor of Puerto Rico, but he used to be the first military governor of the Panama Canal Zone. Many Puerto Rico were forced to migrate there to work for basic need, and like other governors before him, he oppressed any independence movement or any reform movements going on the island at the time, and doing a lot of things to suppress that, like imprisonment, torture, even assassination to certain degrees that people often, forget. We also had the first appointed civilian governor of Puerto Rico was Charles Harbert Allen. He had a complete control of the island of Puerto Rico. He controlled 98% of the sugar processing capacity of the United States, and 40% of the entire island privately belonged to him. Almost half of the island belonged to one man, and he is basically they became a banana republic, just like Nicaragua and Panama during the 20th century. And his company, of this sugar company, making slavery and feudalism, because at the time, up until 1952, the government was based off military-style feudalism. Domino Sugar, which exists today, became rich because of the exploitation of slavery and abuse of Puerto Ricans, especially poor, illiterate, non-white Puerto Ricans. We also had Reddy Herring Post, who was another governor of Puerto Rico, who was a New York politician. And he made a political crisis in 1909 because he's often disagreement with the legislator of Puerto Rican government. Because after 1898, during the Spanish-American War, when they did the first election, and when I mean by election, I'm not talking about the governor. That was U.S. appointed military style. During the first election for Congress, where you could have congressmen who did some legislative session, but they had no really real power. The first 20 years, of American rulership of the Puerto Rico, it was dominated by the Independence Party, also known as the Union Party of Puerto Rico. But over time, they abandoned their independence goal and went to a more conservative approach. We also had the governor Arthur Yeager, who was the governor. He's the reason that he established the Jones Act, which gave U.S. Puerto Rican U.S. state citizenship, but it was only as an excuse to recruit more soldiers during World War One. We also had the governor Emmett Montagnani Reilly. Although every governor beforehand had committed genocide, and to this day the United States is still continuing an ongoing cultural genocide in Puerto Rico, especially in forcing them to remove their identity, indigenous and later Puerto Rican identity. And it was common in early American governors to forbade the Puerto Rican people to learn Spanish in school and be proud of the Puerto Rican identity. They had to be forced Americanized to civilize the savage mentality. And Emmett Montague Reilly was the most pro-American to civilize, and he wanted to make it illegal to teach Spanish in school, which eventually became law a certain period of time. Another controversial dictator in Puerto Rico was James Beverly, who was another governor in Puerto Rico from 1929 to 1932, and also like 1932 to 1933. He was responsible of another genocide of human experimentation against Puerto Ricans, led by the Dr. Cornelius Rowe, who was injecting tuberculosis and cancers against the Puerto Rican people, and there were other doctors committing horrific crimes against humanity. And remember, this is before World War II started. We also have Robert Hay Gore, another American politician who became the governor of Puerto Rico, who was one of the first American governors who promoted Puerto Rican statehood, although it was heavily unpopular. Like I said, from the beginning of Puerto Rican history up till the 1990s, independence was always the majority position. Okay. He was also known for eugenics. But like I said, there were multiple human experimentation against Puerto Rican people, and he wanted to use birth control on poor, illiterate Puerto Rican women, which was still illegal at the time, trying to do experiments. But by consequence, 1/3 of every woman who took the experiment lost the ability to reproduce. And he wanted to relocate Puerto Ricans to Florida to fix the quote-unquote overpopulation problem, which is again based off eugenics assumptions. Then, which is considered without debate the worst governor in the history of Puerto Rico, who was considered absolute dictator, was Plante Winship, who was known for his extreme persecution of everybody who opposed him throughout his time as governor. He supported the Nicaragua dictatorship Anastasio Somoza. He was also responsible for the making the Puerto Rican flag illegal to sing the Puerto Rican national anthem, illegal to teach Spanish in school. He wanted to not remove the minimum wage. And also was behind of the Ponce massacre and the Rio Piedra massacre, and other horrible things he did against the people of Puerto Rico. Then we have Jesus Piñero, who was the first native Puerto Rican to be appointed by the United States governor, but he was the one who put the gag law, which was based on the Anti-Communist Smith Act, which removed the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and the suppression of the independence movement in Puerto Rico. And when the U.S. government for once decided to give Puerto Rico their independence, they needed a bill to pass. Jesus Piñero prevented the bill to pass, despite everybody in the island wanted that bill to come to Puerto Rico to make independent, blocking the only legal opportunity to achieve independence, which started the 1950 revolution. And we also had Luis Muñoz Marin, who was the first governor of Puerto Rico, the architect, of the Commonwealth, the first voted. The same thing, he suppressed the independence movement and used the FBI to suppress any independence movement or achieve their independence. He was a drug addict as well. And during the 1950 revolution, Luis Muñoz Marin, who was the governor at this time, ordered martial law and called the U.S. Air Force to bomb Jayuya and Utuado, killing massive amounts of civilians, and also the Utuado massacre after the mass arrest of thousands of Puerto Ricans, many of them were tortured, human experimentation, and mysteriously assassinated or disappeared. There was also other governors like throughout the 60s and 70s, like Luisa Ferre, who were under their governorship, who were behind death squads in Puerto Rico suppressing the independence movement and state-sponsored terrorism for as a promote statehood. They used terrorism against the independence movement. We also had Carlos Romero Barceló, who was one of the most controversial governors in Puerto Rico, again another dictator, who was the pro-American governor to date, and were trying to completely Americanize the Puerto Rican identity, and he was also behind the Cerro Maravilla massacre, killing innocent civilians. There was also Pedro Rosselló, who was another controversial dictator who privatized many of the things in Puerto Rico, like telephone, electricity, etc., Pinochet style, and many people lost their jobs and their quality of life has worse over time, especially during the Vieques protests, which was supported at first the Navy, who were doing bombing on the island and killing hundreds of civilians until the people finally kicked out the Navy in 2003. We also had the governor Aníbal Acevedo Vila, who was another governor in Puerto Rico, who was known for his corruption and stealing everybody's money basically, while claiming we don't have money to give public employees salary, while he's stealing thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars out the backs of the people, and corruption of the government as well. Luis Fortuño, another governor in Puerto Rico, who was known for another again for corruption and stealing everybody's money, which during the first 3 months of his governorship, around 30,000 people lost their jobs, and many people went on strike. This is during the rise of anarchism that we have since the 1920s. And because of this, his governorship was so controversial because his lack of efficiency, stealing everybody's money, corruption, and other things like the rumors of basically the mafia within the government, which later turned out to be true by future governments over time. Another governor was Alejandro Garcia Padilla, who, with Obama, put the Promesa bill where you had the junta, people in charge the entirety of the economy of Puerto Rico without democratic vote, by the way. Nobody voted for these parties and they're accountable to nobody. And thanks to Fortuño and Padilla, their governorship was so corrupted that the poverty rate of Puerto Rico today has raised to over 40% of the population is in poverty. So yeah, and also we had the most recent dictator, Ricardo Rosselló, who was again for the Telegram controversy of 996 pages of corruption, sexism, homophobia, racism, and scandals of corruption, robbery, manipulation of the media, etc., that he became the first governor to resign on the island. That's basically the entire history of Puerto Rico. Yes, we also have Pedro Verduisi, but he's only been a governor for 1 year, and so far it's been disastrous, especially at the privatization of electricity of the island. So, yeah, nothing new. Puerto Rico is filled with the history of dictatorship run from people from the outside for most of the time, and governors who promote the American government using terrorism, massacres, corruption, scandals, etc. This is why Puerto Rico needs to be free. I highly recommend the channel, the Project Dictator, who subscribe to more videos like these.